Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We're going to start off with an NIL roundtable that happened in Washington, D.C. yesterday. Nick Saban was one of the many people that spoke there that we will get into some of the comments that were made. Some very interesting things came out of this meeting. Then we're going to get into some NFL talk for the next two segments. We're going to start with the NFL free agency is well underway, and as we all know, free agency directly impacts the draft and some of your favorite players from college football, where they're going to be end up playing at the end of the year. So we will get into some of those decisions and how it affects some of your favorite players. Then we're going to jump into some wide receiver rankings that were released by Mel Kiper going into this draft following the scouting combine, and there are a couple of things that I disagree with, so I'll give my own top 10 and you guys can have a fun, let's say a civil argument, if you will, in the comments. And then to finish off the show, we have a great another Spotlight Wednesday. Today we're going to talk about the Florida Gators, a team that there's a lot of question marks, I won't lie to you, but we'll try to break down what the path to victory is for them, what the path to not so victory is for them, but we'll go into all of the different avenues that this Gator season could go under. But before we start, I do want to remind you all that we get a ton of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get on the screen and to see your comments and see your questions, and maybe we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the link at the bottom of the screen. GSMCpodcast.net is a huge help to us here at the network. Obviously, with tip and donations, a huge help to us keeping everything rolling here. And then obviously to you all to have your questions on the screen, see your name pop up on the screen, and ask a question that I can answer in real time. So definitely use GSMCpodcast.net if you have any questions or comments. But let's jump right in. We have had a crazy time around college football. Conference realignment is really starting to come to a head, it feels like, as is the playoff negotiations. And another thing that has had a lot of stories recently and is really gaining traction around a lot of different social circles is NIL. It's something that has been a very, very interesting thing to deal with the last couple of years in college football. But yesterday they made at least a small step towards possibly figuring out some of the issues that we are faced with. Ted Cruz, the senator out of Texas, hosted a roundtable discussion in the Capitol yesterday that was centered around NIL and how to move forward, and kind of the need for the federal government possibly to step in and get involved as soon as possible. This had many guests, obviously Nick Saban being chief among them. The Cavender twins, two people that some of you might know, Haley and Hannah Cavender, played basketball at Miami for some time and were kind of on the forefront of NIL for a very long time, have become kind of TikTok stars, whatever that actually means. But all of them had some very interesting quotes. Greg Burns also spoke, the AD from Alabama, so tons of very interesting perspectives in this group, and it seemed that a lot of it came away with some consensus around the room about the future of college football and at least the idea of what the structure should look like. One of the big things that everyone was pretty steadfast agreed on was revenue sharing needs to be a part of the future of this sport. And if you're wondering what revenue sharing is, it's essentially whether that's through media deals or just straight through the university, it's the players getting a certain cut of the money that they bring in. Which is something that I tend to believe should have been in place a long time ago, and I think it possibly could have been if we went into this NIL world with a little bit better of a roadmap. But as of right now, it seems like there's a lot of consensus around that idea. I totally agree that this needs to be part of the sport because these are the people bringing the money in, and they need to be compensated by the money that is brought in, instead of being compensated by having to go out and do more work to get that extra change that some of these kids need. So I'm all favor for that. The employee model was not a popular one at all by any means. So there does need to be some finagling between the line of you want revenue sharing, but you don't want employees. And sometimes those have been kind of tied together in a lot of these different proposals. So it'll be interesting to see if they're able to kind of find their way in between, find their way into the gray area in between these two opportunities and find a system that works. But one of the very interesting quotes that I think all of us can agree on is the Home Education and the Workforce Committee. One of the members, Representative Burgess Owen, said college sports is essentially pure chaos, and he thinks that the employee model would essentially kill college sports altogether. I'm a little bit more. I'm not necessarily as that doomsday about it. I think there are ways to make the employee model work, but I totally understand this idea because there's worry that if the universities in particular have to go out and pay all of the athletes, even down to swimming and volleyball, which they should be getting paid. There's no two ways about that. But at the end of the day, there's only so much money to go around. For the majority of athletic departments, football is the only sport that makes money. Sometimes you'll have men's basketball, also even less times you'll have men's baseball as well. Those are the elite of the elite athletic departments that have those three teams bringing in a certain amount of revenue to the athletic department. So there's only so much money to go around. There's only so many sports that are bringing in a certain amount of money, right? So you have to be very careful with the way that they allocate resources. So I totally understand why the employee model, at least employees of the university, just doesn't work. It doesn't make much sense. It's not something that is going to be sustainable at the very least. They might be able to make it work for a couple of years, but it's going to be really, really tough to make that work long term with the current balance sheets that a lot of athletic departments are dealing with, that a ton of them are in the red right now. So it would be a very, very tough thing to get their head around. And Nick Saban is someone that for a long time, and even yesterday when speaking about this, was all for revenue sharing. He has been someone that has been kind of on the forefront of that battle that a lot of people have been fighting around college football for a long time. He felt early on that NIL probably wasn't the best way forward, and revenue sharing probably was. But it's another consequence, if you will, of the way that NIL was introduced. All of this started a very, very long time ago. When NIL was introduced, there was no real guardrails. There was no idea of what this entails, what this could possibly, what problems this could create for the players, for the coaches, for administration, for fans, for everyone in between. So they went in without a roadmap, and they're kind of getting what they paid for here. But there were a lot of very interesting bits to this, and I think one of the most interesting things, and a thing that should have been brought up a really long time ago, is the athletes have to have a seat at the table. It was something that Mark Gaston Pierce of the Workers' Right Institution, at Georgetown Law, he said it doesn't make sense for them to not have a collective bargaining agreement among athletes, whether that's of athletes of the SEC and athletes of the Big Ten, or it's school by school basis. I don't know, but I tend to think the conference grouping would be better for this and for in the employee model. I think it could make it work both ways, but we'll see how all this kind of comes to a head. Another very interesting quote was the NIL attorney Darren Hayter, who was on the stand for a couple of different points during this thing, and he said when he was dealing with this, which he deals with a lot of this type of stuff day in and day out, whether it's setting up deals for kids or representing kids in different facets of this new game, but he called it unrestricted free agency on a year-by-year basis. So what we all essentially thought from the get-go is now being confirmed by people that see it in real time and see it very, very up close. He also mentioned that these work weeks that we are putting athletes under, especially college athletes, with a million different things they have to worry about on top of this, but 40 to 60 hours a week working and practicing and playing, all of that stuff is just insane. So he was a big advocate for that. Another person that I'm blanking on the name of, but had brought up the 40 to 60 hour work week. I got to be totally honest, I think that might be a little bit low. I genuinely believe that these kids are working at least 60 hours on their craft, and obviously it's different from sport to sport. But in the college football world, I would not be surprised at all if a lot of these kids, the amount of time they clocked working on being at practice or being at games or working out on your own or putting in film tape study, all of that stuff combined, I'd be shocked if it was anything under 50 hours a week because these kids work just tirelessly to be the best versions of themselves, at least the majority of them. There are some that take full advantage of the good parts without having to deal with the bad parts, but that's a totally different story. But one of the big topics of conversation throughout this whole thing was the Dartmouth men's basketball team. They recently had a vote where they decided they were going to unionize and try to become employees, and now that is going through the legal system, and we will see what happens there. But that decision is huge. If they are able to pull off becoming employees of Dartmouth University, and Dartmouth has to start playing out of their own pocket, things get a little bit sketchy for everyone else in college athletics. I think there's a lot of sentiment. I don't necessarily know the balance sheets at Dartmouth by any means. I don't have them in front of me, but I got to assume they have a alumni base that is more willing to put up a certain amount of money to help this be viable at Dartmouth. But that doesn't mean it would be viable at Vandy, or it would be viable even at a place like Kentucky, or even viable long-term for a place like Georgia. Like, there are a number of schools that would be not able to pull off this model. So it'll be interesting to see what that decision looks like and if that decision has massive ripple effects, because the way I'm looking at it right now, it looks like it could go in the way of the Dartmouth athletes, and if it does, a lot of more athletes are going to follow suit, because if they can, win and become employees and get a steady paycheck, I think they would be much more preferred to that than having to run out and get NIL deals and work overtime on top of everything else that they do to make any money at all. So this is something that I will definitely be keeping my eye out on, because a lot of people will follow suit if they continue. But let's get to the Nick Saban of it all. He came in later on in the discussions and had some very interesting comments. Some that people have kind of ran with and have created this kind of doomsday scenario in college football. And I agree with some of his sentiment, but let's get to a couple of quotes before we jump in. He started with, well, all the things I believed in all of these years of coaching, 50 years of coaching, no longer exist in college athletics. He also mentioned a story where he was on a recruiting visit nearing his end at Alabama, nearing his retirement, and his wife, Miss Terry, came to him and said, why do we do this anymore? All these kids care about is the money that they make. That makes sense. I totally agree that there is a sentiment around older school coaches like Nick Saban that this NIL game has changed the way that they can interact with their athletes. They have to be a little bit more accommodating. They have to be a little bit nicer. They have to, they don't have nearly as much power over these situations as they used to. And some of that is really bad. Some of that creates problems not only for the coaches and the personnel in these departments, but for the players, because NIL has become a tool for a lot of schools to take advantage of these kids. I don't think there's any two ways about that. They know that this is a totally new landscape in the world of college football. It was thrown in with a very little guardrails, and it was given to a bunch of 18-year-olds that probably hadn't taken a law class in their entire lives. So a lot was thrown on these kids' shoulders, and some people took advantage of that. So it's created a lot of problems. There's no two ways about that. I mean, NIL is a totally new thing in this world. It is a thing that is not fun for a lot of the fans out there. But the way I look at it is NIL created a different college football. It didn't ruin college football. It didn't bury college football. It didn't change it for all eternity. And he also went on to talk about how Nick Saban, that is, went on to talk about how developing players on and off the field was always the biggest part of the game, and should always be the biggest part of the game. And while I totally agree with the sentiment that that is the biggest and most important part of college football, I don't think that's gone. I think it's just different. I think the relationship between the coaches and the players is different because the players have more power, and that's just kind of the way things work. But I think when you look at this, you can still have great relationships with your kids. You can still develop them as players and as men. You can still have incredible kids walk in and out of your program using NIL and using all of the things at their disposal. But at the end of the day, it does create a lot of hurdles to get to that point. It creates a lot of hurdles for coaches that are remarkable coaches like Nick Saban that are a little disenthused by the way that college football is going right now. And you obviously don't want to lose more of these guys because of that reason. But at the end of the day, NIL is a great addition to this sport. It's something that has been needed for a very, very long time. It can be a good entity and a good system. The problem is we threw it in with no regulations. So we didn't give kids time to figure out what was going on. We didn't give coaches time to figure out what was going on. And it became a problem because people are going to exploit openings in the system. That's just the way recruiting works. That's the way a lot of business works. So it's hard for me to sit here and say that NIL is burying college football or burying college sports altogether. It's hard for me also to say that there are not big problems that have come because of NIL that need to be fixed. So there's two sides to the coin. I think NIL is a great thing that is being used poorly right now, that has a poor structure around it, a poor ability to oversee it, and if you can even oversee it because of all the antitrust violations you might be going under, and all of these different things that frankly could have been avoided if we started the process of introducing NIL to college football in 2014. That was when the playoff happened. There were plenty of people still pushing for these players to get paid, especially with the extra games that some of these guys were going to be playing. But they didn't. And they waited, and they decided it was going to just be put into place, and we're going to see what happens. And it's created all these problems. And I think whether it's Congress stepping in or another governing body or, I don't know, Nick Saban himself taking over the reins and fixing all the problems, someone's got to do something. And there will be a lot of people that will be out there the second someone tries to do something saying, no, not that thing. Let's try something different. But just try something. Let's take one step forward. Let's at least attempt to solve some of the problems that are faced around NIL. And then you face the next problem when it comes up. But right now, it's just about taking a step forward. It's just about someone stepping up to the plate and being willing to make the hard decisions that need to be made. And if that's Congress, be my guest. I tend to believe that it will not end up being Congress, but if they want to take a whack at it, please do, because we need someone to at least try. Because there have been a lot of people yelling the same thing for a long time, and not a lot of fixes to those problems. So something's got to happen. If it's Congress, great. If it's someone else, great. I genuinely couldn't care who it is. I just need someone to make a move on this and start creating some solutions to these problems. But that was a long-winded little segment there, and I apologize for that. But this is a very complex issue, and a lot of things changing on a day-to-day basis. So we'll try to keep you up to date as much as possible. Obviously, a lot of this stuff happens behind closed doors and is a little hard to keep track of, but whenever something like this happens, like a roundtable out in front of everyone that's televised, there's a ton you can grab from it. And I think yesterday was a step in the right direction. I think we got a lot of consensus across the board. We got a lot of confidence going forward, but at the end of the day, all of that is words, and we need action as quickly as possible. So it'll be interesting to see if Congress steps up. But for right now, we just have to wait and hope that some of these issues will not be issues come 2025 or 2026, whenever that is. But NIL is an ever-changing and ever-confusing thing in the college football world, but it seems like we're making baby steps towards a solution. So that'll do that for that segment, because there's so much there that is continuing to develop that we will definitely get to down the road. But let's get to the NFL segment, or the NFL portion of the show, really. When we come back from this break, we're going to get into NFL free agency a little bit, kind of blur the lines here, talk about how some of the moves that happened, especially Kirk Cousins, affects some of your favorite college players and where they might end up playing at the next level. So definitely stick around for that, and we will be right back.